Few writers have more vividly or accurately predicted the future than George Orwell. In 1947, on the windswept Scottish island of Jura, Orwell sat down to write one of the most important and prophetic novels of the 20th century, maybe in fact of any century. 1984. Oh my goodness. Hello?
Oh, hey, what are you up to?
Just making a video about how George Orwell perfectly predicted the dystopian society in which we live.
Yeah, like, how?
Well, you know, webcams, they're pretty Orwellian. And Alexa, she's a bit, you know. And apparently, I'm not even allowed to say anymore.
Whoa, okay, maybe you don't do that. Maybe you go and read another book, like any book, and leave the Orwell video up to me.
What?
No, I've got this, promise.
Can I at least tell them about today's video sponsor, Surfshark?
Well, how about like halfway through the video?
Silenced by the thought police yet again. It's just not my week.
Fantastic. Oh, sorry about that.
There is a video on Jordan Peterson's YouTube channel called On Free Thought and Speech in London. It was recorded in 2018 whilst Peterson was on the promotional tour for his first mass market book, 12 Rules for Life. He'd been invited, not for the first time, to the BBC's Broadcasting House to be interviewed on several of the station's television and radio news programmes. And, on arriving at the BBC, Peterson was greeted by a statue of the English novelist, journalist, broadcaster and activist George Orwell. The statue itself had been installed in 2017, and not without controversy. The BBC had initially resisted the proposal, given that, despite working for the corporation during the Second World War, Orwell could also be highly critical of its role in public discourse. The statue consists of an enlarged imitation of Orwell, an already pretty tall guy, and stands alongside a quote taken from an initially abandoned, yet later reclaimed, preface to his novella Animal Farm, which reads, "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear." Given Peterson's perception of himself as an embattled truth-teller, despite, at time of writing, having a book on the New York Times bestsellers list and being barely able to move for invitations to interview, it's fairly unsurprising that he connected with this quote. And, perhaps further ironically, given that persecuted perception of himself, a videographer from his publisher, Penguin Random House, was there to capture Peterson's thoughts. Atop a montage of London landmarks in summer, most of the video consists of Peterson relaying a fetishised vision of England as a source of stability and continuity amid centuries of global turmoil. Eventually, however, he does offer us a few words about the man depicted in the statue behind him. With a nod to that Orwell quote about liberty meaning the right to tell people what they do not want to hear, Peterson declares that
one of the things that's part of the great English journalistic tradition is that journalists in particular have the freedom to say what they want and think what they want, and that keeps everyone, including the journalists, honest and on track. And we sacrifice that, especially at the feet of the idea that no one is to be oppressed by anything anyone else says. We sacrifice that at our complete peril.
Peterson goes on to describe Orwell, presumably due to his assumption that he and Orwell would have found common ground on such matters, as one of his intellectual heroes from the 20th century. Now, my initial goal for today's video was simply to explore these kinds of uses of George Orwell and his work as rhetorical ammunition by the political right. My decision to focus on Jordan Peterson was, for the most part, simply to ensure we had a tangible case study of a conservative Orwell botherer to centre our discussion around. On diving into Peterson's work, however, it became clear that his stated affection for Orwell provided more than just an opportunity to critique these lazy, surface-level readings of 1984, it is also highly telling in terms of the worldview which underlies much of Peterson's own work. Whilst I do want to explore what Peterson and his ilk get right about Orwell and what they miss, then I also want to interrogate what this fondness for Orwell might reveal about the core assumptions which underlie Peterson's own attempts to unravel the complexities of our contemporary world. Allusions to Orwell's work, particularly his 1945 satire Animal Farm and his 1949 novel 1984, are frequently thrown around by those on the political right. And it's not hard to see why. Both depict communist revolutions gone wrong, the hopes and dreams of an insurgent working class dashed on the rocks of authoritarianism and political repression. In Animal Farm, the pigs who lead the insurrection against Farmer Jones do little more than take his place as unaccountable rulers. In 1984, a similar revolt has led to the establishment of a regime which seeks to control the very fabric of reality, using various means to limit not only the actions of those under its rule, but through censorship and changes in the language, even what it is possible to think. Animal Farm and 1984 are also alluring reference points for the political right simply due to their sheer cultural ubiquity. 1984 is often touted as one of the most widely read books in the world. Multiple aspects of its world building, the thought police, thought crime, Big Brother, Room 101, 2 + 2 = 5 have become commonly used terms. And this popularity is not disconnected from its political content. The prevalence of 1984 is not only due to it being a compelling read and a powerful piece of political writing, but also due to its use as, in Isaac Deutscher's words, a sort of ideological superweapon in the Cold War. On the book's publication in 1949, one of the first acts of its American publisher, Harcourt Brace, was to write to the FBI, suggesting that "We hope you might be interested in helping to call this book to the attention of the American public, and thus, perhaps, helping to halt totalitarianism." The FBI never officially endorsed the book. Nevertheless, it soon became required reading in school systems across the capitalist West, coming to be interpreted against the context of undulating tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union as, to quote Abbott Gleason and Martha C. Nussbaum, one of the great exposés of the horrors of Stalinism. Now, 1984 is certainly a defiant revocation of Stalinism and of the authoritarianism and repression which were defining features of the mid-century Soviet state. As we'll see shortly, the problem lies in the popular perception that this is all it is, and the manner in which a residual Cold War us versus them lens encourages many people to, like Peterson, view it as an implicit celebration of the institutions and cultural norms of the countries which were opposed to the Soviet Union during those years. In summary, 1984 occupies a strange cultural position, in which the Cold War both defined how it was read by a whole generation, and in which reading it also helped to shape that generation's perceptions of what was at stake in the Cold War itself. And all of this brings us back to Jordan Peterson. As we've seen already, Orwell holds a special place in Peterson's heart. On his website, Peterson offers a list of influential books everyone should read. And 2 texts of Orwell's are included on the list, 1984 and an earlier piece of long-form journalism called The Road to Wigan Pier. But to properly understand Peterson's affection for Orwell, it's necessary to highlight the extent to which Peterson is haunted by the Cold War more broadly. In 12 Rules for Life, he writes that during the 1980s, he was tormented by the fact of the Cold War. It obsessed me. It gave me nightmares. It drove me into the desert, into the long night of the human soul. This was likely an experience shared by many. What's interesting about Peterson is that this obsession never seems to have faded. regardless of the depth that many have attributed to it, it's worth remembering that 12 Rules for Life is a mass-market self-help book based on a Quora post. Yet, even here, Peterson can only get 3 pages in before he's discussing the horrors of Soviet slave labour camps. In fact, despite naming his daughter after Mikhail Gorbachev, who inadvertently contributed to the end of the Soviet Union, one gets the sense on reading Peterson's work that no one's told him that the Cold War is over. He is somewhat reminiscent of Hiro Onoda, the Japanese soldier who, living in hiding on the Philippine island of Lubang, still believed himself to be fighting the Second World War 30 years after it ended. It's present in the apocalyptic style of Peterson's prose, his unshakable belief in the individual and fear of the collective, and the manner in which he continues to see reds under the bed, passing everyone he disagrees with as not only a postmodern neo-Marxist, but as akin to a foreign agent working to destroy his beloved Western culture. We have then one writer, Orwell, whose work became a means to make sense of the Cold War and what was at stake in the battle between capitalism and communism, and another, Peterson, for whom a Cold War understanding of the world, partly adopted through reading Orwell, indelibly marks his thinking. Yet, as I've hinted, to view 1984 as only critical of the Soviet Union or as a celebration of Western capitalism is to ignore considerable elements of the text. Before we discuss Peterson any further then, I think it's useful to develop a more contextualised and more complex understanding of what Orwell was trying to do with 1984 and his work more broadly. A key thing to note about George Orwell is that he wasn't exactly someone who went looking for politics, but rather, partly due to a series of life choices and partly due to the era in which he lived, someone for whom resisting some degree of political engagement gradually became impossible. In an essay titled Why I Write, published towards the end of his life, Orwell posited that in a peaceful age, I might have written ornate or merely descriptive books, and might have remained almost unaware of my political loyalties. Unfortunately for him, and pretty much everyone else alive at the time, the age in which Orwell lived was not a peaceful one, instead being characterised by economic crises, revolutions, and war. Born in 1903 to a relatively well-off family, there are a handful of key experiences which shaped Orwell's political outlook. The first was his time serving as an imperial police officer in Burma, now Myanmar, which was then part of the British Empire. Despite being, as Mounting Ung writes, an efficient police officer who once ended an argument with a schoolboy by beating him with a stick, Orwell grew to see imperialism as an evil thing, which oppressed the colonised whilst spiritually corrupting the colonisers. The second formative set of experiences were his various tramping expeditions, in which, curious to find out what life was like for those outside his privileged bubble, he went to live amongst the urban poor of Paris and London, and later amongst coal miners in the north of England. All of these experiences would be used as the bases for books by Orwell, yet more than this, they also pushed him to develop an interest in matters of class and the inequitable distribution of wealth and power. The defining experience of Orwell's life, however, came in 1936, when, accompanied by his wife, Eileen, he travelled to Spain to enlist as a soldier in the Spanish Civil War. See, earlier that year, the people of Spain had elected a government consisting of a coalition of socialist, communist and republican, here meaning anti-monarchy, parties. In response, right-wing generals led by Francisco Franco and supported by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy launched a military uprising. A bloody civil war followed. Whilst most neighbouring countries ignored calls to support the Spanish government in fighting the fascist insurrection, more than 40,000 foreign volunteers travelled to Spain independently to fight. Many of these foreign volunteers were committed socialists, communists, and anarchists. Orwell, by contrast, was fairly sceptical of these movements. In The Road to Wigan Pier, he had launched a pretty uncompromising attack, if not on socialism itself, then certainly on socialists, who he saw as an elitist bunch, driven as much by envy and dogma as by a sense of injustice and empathy. Jordan Peterson likes to pick out some of these passages in his talks. In fact, Orwell's previous attacks on socialists and on Stalinist Russia led to him being denied permission to join the communist-run International Brigades, and he instead joined a militia run by the Trotskyist POUM party. Reflecting on his arrival in Barcelona in his memoir, Homage to Catalonia, Orwell wrote that, "When one came straight from England, the aspect of Barcelona was something startling and overwhelming. It was the first time that I had ever been in a town where the working class was in the saddle." The hope and humanity that Orwell found in the near-classless society of Barcelona during the early years of the Civil War would push aside some of his more contrarian tendencies and turn him into a deeply committed socialist. On his return to England, he wrote in a letter to a friend that, "I have seen wonderful things, and at last really believe in socialism, which I never did before." Yet, at the same time, Orwell's experiences in Spain would confirm his suspicions about the authoritarianism of the Soviet Union. For Soviet support for the Spanish government's fight against the fascist insurrection came with strings attached. This eventually led to anarchists, Trotskyists, and others who had previously been considered allies being denounced and ultimately arrested en masse. Orwell and his wife narrowly escaped these purges, having returned home after Orwell was shot in the neck by a fascist sniper. Nevertheless, he returned to England as both a committed socialist and a defiant critic of the Soviet regime. It's this perspective of a belief in socialism, but a disdain for the corruption of that ideal which occurred under Stalin, which Orwell would bring to both Animal Farm and 1984. Both are, yes, stories of revolutions gone wrong, corrupted by opportunists seeking to gain power, but in many ways mourn for what could have been. As Orwell would later famously put it, "Every line of serious work that I have written since 1936 has been written, directly or indirectly, against totalitarianism and for democratic socialism." What I want to primarily draw out in this video, however, are the deep critiques of English, or more broadly, given Peterson's use of the notion, Western society, which are contained within 1984. For the novel was not only inspired by Orwell's close shaves with Stalinist forces in Spain, but also by his experiences of surveillance, censorship, and propaganda after he returned to England. And once we apply some of that context, Jordan Peterson standing in front of a statue of Orwell outside the BBC, claiming his work as a vindication of Western society, begins to seem very peculiar indeed. So we might not quite be living in George Orwell's dystopian nightmare, but there are plenty of wannabe big brothers out there trying to snoop on your online activity. Luckily, you can shut out their trackers and malware by signing up to the fantastic VPN services of Surfshark. Head over to surfshark.deals/Tom Nicholas to get 83% off a 2-year plan and an extra 3 months for free, allowing you to securely and privately browse the web for just $2.21 a month. We all know that we should probably be doing more to keep our online activity hidden from the prying eyes of internet service providers and increasingly tracker-ridden websites. Surfshark has enabled me and can enable you to do so quickly and easily with no advanced tech knowledge required by essentially creating a private internet connection to keep you safe and secure whenever you're online. Surfshark is packed with features. I particularly like their clean web mode, which not only blocks malware but also ads, making cluttered, ad-filled web pages a thing of the past. You can also use it to trick websites such as streaming services into thinking you're in other countries, unlocking tons of extra content. And if you don't like it, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee. So if you want to take advantage of that time-limited offer of 83% off a 2-year plan and an extra 3 months for free, you can support the channel by letting them know I sent you through heading over to surfshark.deals/Tom Nicholas. Right, now back to that other guy, I guess. I won't bore you with too much of a recap of the premise of 1984 here. In short, the novel centres on Winston Smith, a man living in what, at Orwell's time of writing, was an imaginary future version of London. In the world of the novel, the UK has been subsumed by the multi-continental society of Oceania, a one-party authoritarian state. Under the leadership of the enigmatic Big Brother, the party, INGSOC, keeps a close watch on its citizens through the installation of cameras and microphones in both homes and public spaces. The secretive thought police are also said to be lurking around every corner. The party's primary source of control, however, lies in the propagation of endless amounts of propaganda and the censorship of anything which might damage people's devotion to the party. The protagonist, Winston Smith, plays a key role in this. As a party functionary, he works in the Ministry of Truth, falsifying historical documents. If the party's official position changes on any given topic, from the quantity of chocolate ration to each citizen to which of the world's other superpowers Oceania is currently at war with, Smith's job is to edit newspaper clippings and the like, so that anyone who decided to look into it would be unable to prove that things had ever been any different. Now, it's pretty self-evident that the world of 1984 is based heavily on Orwell's approximation of what life was like in the Soviet Union. Big Brother is a clear stand-in for Joseph Stalin, the official ideology of Oceania is English socialism, and people are regularly disappeared, either being killed or sent to far-off labour camps. But Russia is not the novel's only focus. For one, Orwell jumps at the chance to include in his dystopian vision of the future a list of seemingly random personal bugbears, such as the use of the 24-hour clock, the selling of beer in litres rather than pints, urbanisation, and women not wearing enough makeup. More importantly, the book is also laden with critiques of what Orwell saw as the authoritarian activities of the British state before, during, and after the Second World War. For whilst Orwell was, like other anti-Stalinists, heavily surveilled by the Soviet Secret Service during his time in Spain, details of these efforts only emerged after his death. It was whilst in England, and at the hands of the British government, that he had his most visceral experiences of both surveillance and censorship. Orwell often had to edit his work to stay on the right side of the UK's stringent anti-obscenity laws, and his political views landed him on more active watch lists too. Just months after returning to England from Spain in 1939, for example, he was visited by 2 police officers with orders to confiscate a series of supposedly obscene books. The authorities have found out about his purchases by intercepting his post. Following this event, Orwell wrote in his diary that it appears that the opening of letters to persons connected with left-wing parties is now so normal as to excite little remark. Orwell wouldn't have known that MI5 had been keeping a close watch on him since 1936, when his attendance at Communist Party meetings whilst researching the road to Wigan Pier had made him an object of suspicion. He did, however, have several further experiences of censorship. Namely, Animal Farm's road to publication was beset by roadblocks placed in its path by both Russian influence and the whims of the British establishment. Orwell's previous publisher, Victor Gollancz, felt it to be too pointedly anti-Soviet. It was rejected from Faber and Faber by T.S. Eliot, who thought it too anti-capitalist, and it was initially accepted by Jonathan Cape, but then rejected again after the firm received a letter of warning from the UK Ministry of Information. Although, to add another twist to this tale, the person who was generally agreed to have sent that letter later turned out to be a Soviet spy. Nevertheless, the most pressing influence on 1984 to take account of, given the clip of Jordan Peterson that we began this video with, is the time that Orwell spent working at the BBC during the Second World War. Partly as a result of his experiences as a colonial cop, Orwell was recruited to produce and write radio programmes to be broadcast in India. His time was split between producing cultural programming, such as poetry readings, and news broadcasts. As C. Flea and M.L. Sanders write, however, all the programmes to India and elsewhere in which Orwell took part or which were scripted by him were a contribution to an overall propaganda effort. Orwell was more than aware of this, although he wrote in a letter to a friend that he hoped to have kept our propaganda slightly less disgusting than it might otherwise have been. He could be relied upon to circulate what he felt to be outright falsehoods if it served the war effort. He wrote in his diary in 1942 that, "I am regularly alleging in all my newsletters that the Japanese are plotting to attack Russia. I don't believe this to be so." He also wrote several scripts praising Stalin as having brought happiness and freedom to the people of Russia, despite evidently being convinced that the opposite was true. Orwell found ways to justify his role as a propagandist, writing that, "As to the ethics of broadcasting, and in general letting oneself be used by the British governing class, it's of little value to argue about it. It is chiefly a question of whether one considers it more important to down the Nazis first." Yet both this feeling of complicity and of being inside the propaganda factory deeply informs 1984. In fact, Winston Smith's day-to-day existence at the Ministry of Truth can be far more easily compared with Orwell's time at the BBC and his wife Eileen's wartime employment in the censorship department of the Ministry of Information than it can be to anything specific that happened in the Soviet Union, a country which Orwell never once set foot in. Jordan Peterson and other conservatives who draw upon Orwell for rhetorical ammunition are therefore right that he was a committed opponent of the Soviet Union. Yet, as Peterson's comments outside the BBC show, they often take this to mean that his work sought to celebrate the institutions and cultural norms of the capitalist West. As we've seen, this is far from the case. Whilst Orwell was very prone to Peterson-esque attacks on intellectuals, he also recognised that, as he wrote in 1946, in England the immediate enemies of truthfulness and hence freedom of thought are the press lords, the film magnates and the bureaucrats. For Peterson to stand beside a statue of Orwell declaring that one of the things that's part of the great English journalistic tradition is that journalists in particular have the freedom to say what they want is frankly ludicrous. Orwell's journalistic career involved him frequently not being able to publish certain articles because editors and publishers didn't agree with them, or whilst at the BBC having to outright lie. In that sense, 1984 is very much a plague on both your houses novel, with as much to say about censorship, surveillance and authoritarianism in the West as in the Soviet Union. In truth, Orwell was a hugely frustrating, changeable and contrarian writer, and it's unlikely that anyone could read his body of work without finding some things that they agree with and other things they would deeply contest. It's probably no huge revelation to say that the approach favoured by Jordan Peterson and his ilk is to pick out ideas which support their positions while flat out ignoring anything which might challenge them. That being said, I want to close out this video by flipping our focus. For whilst Peterson might, by choice or otherwise, only have a limited understanding of Orwell, I think Orwell, and 1984 in particular, might provide a useful lens through which to understand Peterson. Love him or loathe him, Jordan Peterson is an eclectic thinker. Whether in his books, lectures or interviews, he covers an abundance of topics and draws, with varying degrees of success, on a wide range of fields. What I want to focus on here is his frequent warnings about what he sees as the decline of Western culture. For it is this warning that Western culture is currently in crisis which provides the framing for much of Peterson's work. He writes in 12 Rules for Life that, in the West we have been withdrawing from our tradition, religion, and even nation-centred cultures, partly to decrease the danger of group conflict. But we are increasingly falling prey to the desperation of meaninglessness, and that is no improvement at all. As a political project, if not as an academic one, Peterson clearly sees his writing and lectures as intended to halt this slide towards chaos. Yet, what is Western culture? The phrase is certainly thrown around a lot, and most of us have a vague idea of what someone is referring to when they use it. But what we find is that as soon as we try to define it with any real degree of specificity, it proves to be quite a hazy notion. Now, there's not time to fully explore the emergence of the idea of the West or critiques of it here, although if you'd like to see a video on that topic, do let me know down in the comments. Suffice it to say that the idea that there exists a thing called Western culture, and by extension that that culture is currently in crisis, relies upon three presuppositions. Firstly, that the culture that one applies that label to exhibits some degree of homogeneity. Secondly, that there has been a degree of historical continuity to that culture prior to this moment of supposed crisis, and thirdly, that this culture is in some way unique or distinct from other cultures. Now, like many others who use the term, Peterson doesn't seem to have ever offered a clear definition of what he believes Western culture to consist of. He's never explained where its geographical limits might lie, who it includes and who it doesn't. Yet, he is clear on what its substance is. In one of the lectures in his Maps of Meaning series, he argues that the proposition that underlies Western culture is that there's a transcendent morality predicated on the idea of God. To Peterson then, Western culture appears to refer to people and places that have been influenced by Christianity. Perhaps I'm being a bit generous here in taking this as a definition, but this is actually far more specific than many other definitions of Western culture or the West, which generally try to draw a continuous line, starting with the ancient Greeks, weaving through the colonial nations of Europe, and ending in the contemporary United States. From Plato to NATO, as David Gress titled his 1998 book on the topic. Yet, even this focus on Christianity fails to truly address those presuppositions. On the point of homogeneity, Christians have spent as much of history tearing chunks out of each other as sharing in the body of Christ. And despite sharing a sacred text, different denominations extract wildly different modes of morality and being from the Bible. On the point of historical continuity, societies influenced by Christianity have taken wildly different forms throughout history. The religion has been integrated into feudalism, empire, fascism, and various forms of capitalism. In fact, making the case for such homogeneity and continuity would require sanding off the details to such an extent that it would be at the cost of our third presupposition, distinctiveness. For at that point, how distinct is Christianity from the other Abrahamic religions, or any other belief system for that matter? In truth, the idea of Western culture has always been one without substance, defined instead by what it is not. As Kwame Anthony Appiah writes, the very idea of the West, to name a heritage and an object of study, doesn't really emerge until the 1890s, during a heated era of imperialism. The West, at this point, was a way of distinguishing between the imperialist nations of Europe and the countries that Europe was colonising. When those empires began to disintegrate in the middle of the 20th century, the term came instead to be used to distinguish between the capitalist nations and those in the Soviet sphere of influence. Since the fall of the USSR, however, the notion of the West has increasingly failed to cohere. For a brief period, militant Islamists plugged the gap in providing something to define the West against, although that moment too seems to have all but passed. If, as Peterson argues, Western culture is in crisis in the present day, then I would suggest it is because it lacks an other to define itself against. The US's occasional saber-rattling against China or Russia perhaps seeks to rekindle some kind of us versus them geopolitical perception of the world, but it certainly hasn't reached the cultural pervasiveness of those previous cultural imaginaries. It's no surprise that Peterson finds this difficult to come to terms with. Not only is he obsessed with the Cold War, but his work is built on a series of binary oppositions, order and chaos, masculine and feminine, society and nature, which all, to some extent, only take on meaning through a conceptual opposition to their other. Faced with an object of study which essentially lacks any real substance, Peterson thus has to continually return to the ghost of the Soviet Union as a point of contrast for what the West is not, or otherwise to paint those with a different view of what our world could and or should look like, the postmodern neo-Marxists he's so fond of, as external aggressors. 1984 perhaps provides an interesting lens on this. A key part of the novel's world building is that Oceania is at constant war with one of two other superpowers, Eurasia and East Asia. The war itself only ever leads to minor gains or losses in terms of territory, yet it serves a useful political purpose at home. For the presence of a shared enemy and a shared commitment to fighting the war discourages people from asking too many questions about Oceania itself. In fact, with the ideals of the revolution having long since faded, the war is the only thing that really orients and defines this society. The idea of Western culture, which Peterson trades off, is similar. Despite his best efforts to convince us otherwise, it lacks any real substance. If Western culture is in crisis, then perhaps it's because, like the weird conglomeration of distant nations that make up Oceania in 1984, it's because it never really existed in the first place. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it's been worthy of your time. If you found it interesting or enjoyable in any way, then I would be very, very grateful if you would consider sharing it with a friend or friends, either online or off, who you think might also get something out of it. Thank you, as ever, to J. Fraser Cartwright, to Richard, Sindri Nilsson, Kaya Lau, David Brothers, Max DeVos, Alan Gann, Luke Meyer, Gary, Dylan Gordon, Dick on Spain, Greg Miller, Bill Mitchell, Al Zweigart, ZC Rees, Brent Cottle, Shab Kumar, Colin York, Anil and Timo Kashelas for being signed up to the top tier of my Patreon. If you'd like to join them in getting early access to videos, copies of the scripts to them and more, then you can find out how to do so at patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. Thanks so much once again for watching and have a fantastic week.